The Sex Pistols were the first band ever shown to me that was called punk rock. They're by no means my favorite punk band, hell, they're not even my favorite punk band from the UK. But when I think of the term punk rock, they're one of the first bands to pop into my head. They're the reason many first heard the term, and they're still synonymous with the genre more than any other band if you ask me. Sure, mouth breathers will be quick to call them manufactured by Malcolm McLaren, but that's a load of BS. Malcolm was of course very important to the band, as any good manager is, but if the Sex Pistols were manufactured, then so was the Beatles, The Clash, Alice Cooper, Joy Division, New Order, and the Rolling Stones. The only reason people say this about the Pistols is because Malcolm had a bad habit of running his mouth and taking more credit than what he actually earned. And I think people just like the irony of a band like the Sex Pistols supposedly being manufactured. But there's not really much truth to it. Literally everyone in the British punk scene has called Malcolm out on his BS, not just the Pistols.
And you guys were just talking about Malcolm McLaren. I definitely want to kind of ask you a few questions about him, because he obviously was so instrumental in the formation of different bands, but he was kind of a sort of a unifying factor. And
well, that's the way he would tell the story, to be quite honest.
And me, being the big fan of Sex Pistols I was extremely cautious of a miniseries about the band coming out, especially on Disney+. Some anxieties were quelled when I found that Danny Boyle was directing it, whom I am a big fan of for his work on Trainspotting, 28 Days Later, Sunshine, and 127 Hours. And the fact that it was a miniseries meant that the story wouldn't have to be rushed to fit within a 90-minute feature, and it could use more of the characters and people from the scene. But those anxieties kind of returned when John Lydon came out blasting it long before it even came out. In fact, Lydon was responsible for a Streisand effect of sorts, because if he didn't complain about it so much, nowhere near as many people would even be aware of this miniseries. Including myself, I likely would have forgotten about it. He's called it a middle-class fantasy, but he has said that he hasn't even seen it or read the script because they didn't let him. Which is fair to be upset about, but maybe reserve your judgments on the supposed quality of the series and instead bitch about them not letting you see any of it. Way more people would be on his side if he did that. He said if it was based on Steve Jones' book Lonely Boy, then why are they using his image to sell it? But it's about Steve Jones' time in the Pistols, so it's impossible to not feature John to some extent. He lost a court case to veto the series due to illegal agreements they made in 1998 that stated that band decisions for licensing and stuff of the like were to be determined on a majority rules basis. And since Steve Jones, Paul Cook, Glenn Matlock, and the estate of Sid Vicious were okay with the series, Mr. Rotten was SOL. I saw one interview and honestly, I can't fault him too much. Of course he wouldn't agree to it, they wouldn't even let him see a script. And it's not just Steve's legacy they're messing with, it's everybody involved with the Sex Pistols. You can't fault him for being angry. But then he started shilling for NFTs in that very same interview.
Well, I'm connected to an Alzheimer's organisation called Spitz. I did an NFT drawing.
I know it's for a good cause and I commend him, but still, that's like burning down a rainforest for more clean drinking water in Africa. In response, Danny Boyle said to The Guardian, "I love Lydon for what he does and I don't want him to like it. I want him to attack it. I think that's his absolute right." Which to me comes across as hardcore copium. And turns out, I was right, because he later contradicted himself when speaking to Metro. He was asked if he thought Mr. Rotten would at some point change his tune about the series, and he said, "Contrarianness is a calling card really, so even if he liked it, he will find a way not to. We hope he does because we think it's very respectful and an acknowledgement of his genius." So what is it, Danny? Do you want him to like it, or do you want him to bash it? But before we look into the series itself, I thought it'd be fun to rewatch other films regarding this band, and in the case of the first film, watch for the very first time. Directed by Julian Temple, The Great Rock and Roll Swindle. This was the only one of these films I had never seen previously. Despite my dad owning it and letting me see far worse stuff at a young age, he, for whatever reason, never let me watch this one. And maybe it's for the best because this movie blows. It's a mockumentary chronicling the rise and demise of the band, but it's so incoherent and I found myself falling asleep. No one can act, the writing is atrocious, and Malcolm McLaren's attempt at making himself seem like the Svengali of the punk scene is laughable. But then again, maybe it isn't, because this film is what made a lot of people think the band was manufactured. And I must say, if a piece of shit like this made you think that, then I really hope you never breed. The only reason to watch this would be to see the videos for their covers of Something Else and My Way. But I'm not kidding when I say that the best part about this movie is the end with the cover of Friggin' and the Riggin'. And on another note, the album is pretty bad too. with only a few songs worth saving like Belson Was a Gas, Don't Give Me No Lip Child, Silly Thing, and the above mentioned covers sang by Sid. Next one I saw was Sid and Nancy, and it's a pretty good flick. The acting from the titular characters is fantastic, though Chloe Webb's Nancy seems a bit too over the top, with her New York accent and raspy ass voice being a bit too much at times.
Tell me we're gonna do any smack the left of the team, and you don't even save me, any you fuckhead! Shit, you asshole motherfucking
Then that's probably more due to the direction, and of course Gary Oldman always kills it. The original soundtrack is pretty good, and it does a good job of showing how destructive drug addiction can be. Though I would be remiss not to include how badly they did the other members of the Pistols, especially Paul Cook, look at him. Alex Cox made them all look like morons. Johnny hated how they gave him a Scouse accent even though he's from London. The only member of the band who had any sort of involvement was Glenn Matlock, who played bass on some songs on the soundtrack. But he was the only member of the band who wasn't even in the film. Swing and a miss.
For someone who didn't know anything about the Sex Pistols, I guess it was a good, way of describing it. But it's really hard for me to like be judgmental of it because I was actually there at the time,
Right.
I mean, I didn't like the guy who played me.
Vile, it was awful. What a non-truth of a movie. There you go, that's an Oxford graduate or undergraduate, whatever he is, making this silly, non-realistic film. I mean, we are still alive, most of us, and there we are being misrepresented in a grotesque way.
Johnny also thought it glorified heroin with the scene at the end with Nancy and Sid in the taxi, but that's only really glorification if you remove it from the context of the rest of the film. There's also not much attention to detail, the guys fake playing their instruments are doing a horrendous job, and even when you can see Sid not playing bass with the band, you can still hear bass being played in the songs. Joe Strummer's songs he made for the film blow, but I'm not a big Clash fan to begin with, and the scene where the band breaks up is both extremely inaccurate and just plain stupid.
I want to leave the band.
Yeah, I do as well.
But it's overall a good movie, despite how inaccurate it can be at times with the band, the other members of the Pistols, and getting a white woman to sing an X-Ray Spec song. I know it's banal, but that really pisses me off on principle. But you can't deny the many things this film gets right, which is why I'd still recommend it today if this seems like something that would be up your alley. The last thing I saw before our main event was the documentary The Filth and the Fury, and out of everything I watched, this was the one thing I enjoyed the most. It was also directed by Julian Temple, the same guy who directed The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, I guess as a sorry towards the other members after making whatever the hell this is supposed to be. This documentary is supposed to tell the band side of the story, since Temple's previous attempts was largely made up of Malcolm spewing nonsense. Malcolm does have a little time to speak, though I'm pretty sure they're just using archival footage. They mainly just use narration, which I like in documentaries like these, so they can set the mood with better visuals, though they sometimes shoot some interviews in silhouettes, like a crime documentary, which I'm pretty sure is purely for aesthetic reasons. I mean, by this point they already done a few reunion tours, and you can tell that they clearly just dubbed their narration over these shots.
First time I came across Nancy, I think Steve was shagging her in the toilet. I didn't like her.
And I really loved at the end where John just lets it all out about Sid and what happened to him. You just want to give him a hug.
I've lost my friend. I couldn't have changed it. I was too young. God, I wish I was smarter. You can look back on it and go, I could have done something. He died, for fuck's sake.
If you want a good film, you watch Sid and Nancy. If you want a proper retelling of the band's story, you watch The Filth and the Fury. And if you want to be bored and confused for an hour and change, you watch The Great Rock and Roll Swindle. But how does this new series Pistol stack up to the previous efforts? This series is not really for us, fans of the Sex Pistols and punk rock. Sure, it's about the band, and there's some fan service to be found, but it's still not for us. When big companies like Disney put big money behind a miniseries, they don't want it to be seen by 1 million people. They want it to be seen by 1 billion people. They want to market it towards more than just the troglodytes like me who can recite every line from Nevermind the Bollocks from memory. They're mostly made for people who boringly browse Disney Plus for something to watch, only to see something they vaguely recognize in the Sex Pistols' name and click to watch. I say this so people aren't bamboozled going in when the writers willingly forego historical accuracy so they can hit conventional beats of your average rise and fall story you see in biopics. I'm not saying all biopics do this, but most do. Episode 1 starts with some archival footage and a live version of Bowie's Moon Age Daydream with some old footage of Ziggy interpolated throughout, until we see a young Steve Jones, played by Toby Wallace, who daydreams for a moment in a scene I actually really like, just before up and stealing all the gear. And Toby Wallace's performance is pretty good for the most part. He has a good amount of charisma and he has good chemistry with the other actors, though I feel they kind of paint him a bit too much as a blank slate so viewers can project themselves onto him, but I guess I can excuse it. Since the story is based on Steve's book, you can expect it to be mainly focused on him, and you'd be correct. There's a pretty big focus on his upbringing and how it shaped him into the man he became. I like this, since most of the time in these biopics, the focus is put on the singer or most easily recognizable guy in the band. But Steve Jones is arguably the most important member of this band, and one of the more normal members, so putting him in the middle between all these odd characters like Johnny Rotten, Sid Vicious, and Malcolm McLaren keeps the story grounded and relatable. And this first episode showcases how destitute his life is at this point. He's kicked out of his home, and we see the abuse he suffered as a child. It's shot in 4:3, which makes the series seem more vintage in a way that isn't insulting. You can tell it was shot with that aspect ratio in mind, and it wasn't an afterthought. The cinematography is fantastic. It was done by Anthony Dode Mantle, who's worked on other Danny Boyle projects. He's also worked with the likes of Ron Howard and Lars von Trier. It's hard to describe, but the cinematography feels very British. It's grimy and dirty, but it can be flashy when need be. There's even visual motifs with how the camera moves in shots like when the band is playing their first gig. And there's also some really cool surrealist elements throughout the series, like when Steve and Chrissie Hynde, played by Sydney Chandler, sing Starman together. And speaking of Chrissie Hynde, her portrayal is quite odd. I'm aware she was part of the scene and worked in Malcolm's shop, but was there any reason for her to act as an on-again, off-again, will-they-won't-they potential girlfriend to Steve and have so much time devoted to it? I'm not kidding, there's a couple of sex scenes between the two. Yes, she did almost marry Steve so she could stay in the US, but that's about it. The real Steve and Chrissie themselves were very surprised to find out this fake affair takes up so much screen time, let alone exists. Look, in biopics, I can excuse embellishments of the truth. You gotta make it interesting somewhere. But when shit is pulled out of thin air, that's what gets me annoyed. There's plenty of things that happened in and around this band for realsies. Why not talk about that? No, dude, you don't get it. We have to have a bland love affair that does very little to advance either character in any meaningful way. And it's kind of a shame because Sydney Chandler does a commendable job, but they just really fumbled the ball. In fact, the only reason I think Chrissie is even in so much of the series is so people can soy face at home after seeing a name they recognize.
See you on stage, Chrissie Hynde.
What is this, an Avengers movie? The writing in general, and even the editing, can be questionable. Much of the writing is too on the nose for my liking.
All them dinosaur bands with their old look at me 15-minute guitar solos, that don't mean nothing to us. Because we're pissed off, we're bored, we're trying to scrape together enough for another pint. We're invisible. No one gives a shit about us. You know, so we don't give a shit about no one else. Maybe that should be our image.
Is that really necessary to spell out? I think that's something the viewer can already make out. In the scene where Steve is driving Malcolm McLaren around, they inexplicably use a bunch of snippets from the film The Italian Job, and I really don't understand why. Did they just want an excuse to use Michael Caine's classic line?
Hang on a minute, lads. I've got a great idea.
You and Viv should come see us rehearse.
Again, is spelling it out to such an extent even necessary? Can you not put any faith into your audience? There's also odd scenes like when Steve sees people having sex in the car and he stops to watch and whack his cack. Now, I've yet to read Steve's book, and I wouldn't be surprised if something like this did actually happen. But regardless, it serves no real purpose other than to include some edginess in the first episode so people won't write off the series because it's on Disney+. I'm glad this series isn't PG-13 because this band's story can't really be told in such a sanitized way, but that doesn't mean I want gratuitous sex and violence whenever they can fit it in. It just seems forced. The flaws of the writing made more sense when I realized the series was written by a guy named Craig Pearce, whose only work of note is writing for many Baz Luhrmann films, and yeah, that's maybe not the best choice. If you were able to get a director on the level of Danny Boyle and a cinematographer on the level of Anthony Dode Mantle, why not a writer who could stand toe-to-toe with them? Well, it turns out the series was created by him. Kind of a weird word to use since it's based on true events, but it seems like the series is stuck with him, which is a real shame because this story deserves far better than him. And nothing against the guy, he's probably a chill dude, but it's fair to say he's way out of his depth. Steve's bandmates are comprised of Wally Nightingale, played by Dylan Llewellyn, Glenn Matlock, played by Christian Lee, and Paul Cook, played by Jacob Slater. They're all fine, but blended to the background a lot of the time, though Glenn actually has an interesting dynamic with Steve and the rest of the band. They play up his lameness, which I doubt the real Glenn was pleased about, but it works within the context of the series.
We are going to the toppermost of the poppermost. What?
I also love the scene on the beach where he's telling Steve how much he admires him, and later when Steve is kicking him out of the band. Glenn starts out all jolly, but he gets somewhat sinister when he realizes what's going on.
Whenever Malcolm feels like shafting you, you just bend over, don't you? Malcolm's a good little boy. Oh, you love that.
I really love the dynamic he has between the other members when it showed. I just wish he wasn't completely dropped from the series after he was sacked. And rounding out our main cast in the first episode is Malcolm McLaren, played by Thomas Brody Sangster, and Vivian Westwood, played by Tallulah Riley. Vivian is a lovable but stern mother figure of sorts to Steve, and I like how they showcased how important she was to much of the punk scene's fashion and philosophy. When you think of a stereotypical punk rocker, you will more than likely think of something derivative of her work, if not some of her actual pieces. And Malcolm has a weird arc, starting out as just a man who wants what's best for Steve and the band he's in, to a manipulative tyrant who is largely responsible for the downfall of the band he once nurtured. Though you see the seeds in effect for his transformation from his very first appearance. And I must say, Thomas Brody Sangster, fuck that's a long name, gives by far the best performance to be found in this series. At first I thought he was too much of a caricature, but it slowly grew on me. He can be maniacal but suave, and he absolutely oozes charisma from his pores. You can always tell he's a man with a plan in every scene, his cunning nature is always on display, and his voice is perfect.
How are my sexy young assassins?
Sangster was also in a biopic I really loved called Nowhere Boy as Paul McCartney, and I thought he was great in that as well, despite being too short for Sir Paul's tastes. The first episode shows Steve getting arrested for trying to steal gear, only to be saved from jail time after Malcolm shows up to the courtroom and blags his way to getting Steve off with only a slap on the wrist. This action is part of the reason why Malcolm is so important to Steve throughout the series. He's the father he never had, so it's hard for him to turn on Malcolm like everyone else could so easily. This, I think, is an acceptable way to stretch the truth in my opinion. In reality, Steve and Malcolm were just really good mates, and I don't think there was such a paternal relationship between them, but you could easily infer it when you know the foundations of their relationship. However, I don't really like the ending with the original lineup of the band with Steve on vocals, tanking after he suffers intense stage fright. It just seems like a done-to-death cliche that doesn't really need to be shown. I like the reveal of Steve's dad sexually abusing him, but nothing else really goes anywhere. They just use it as an excuse to milk all the sads, especially since they used fucking Wish You Were Here in the soundtrack after Steve runs off stage. I know they use it to then cut to Johnny writing I Hate Pink Floyd on his t-shirt, but they used the song to have an emotional impact on the audience. What they did with Johnny and his introduction was clearly secondary. Also, who is he looking at? They also do a similar thing when Sid joins the band a few episodes later, which makes even less sense because that's not even his introduction as a character. These theatrics honestly just really annoy me. John Lydon / Johnny Rotten is played by Anson Boone, and he honestly does a good job. Again, it seems somewhat like a caricature, like with the guy who plays Malcolm, and he constantly contorts his face to not look like such a pretty boy. I don't know, it just makes him look too outlandish, and sometimes he just looks like a drug addict. But I guess it's more about getting the idea of the man across, rather than have someone who looks just like Lydon. But besides that, he does a good job. He has the right posture, body language, his voice is pretty much perfect, and he has really good comedic timing when the situation calls for it.
The song is called No Future. Fuck!
If nothing else, it's better than the guy from Sid and Nancy.
Exterminate! Exterminate!
The guy who plays Sid also does a good job. He's no Gary Oldman, but it's more than serviceable. The second episode starts with a segment showcasing Pamela Rook, played by Macy Williams of Game of Thrones fame, and how she would rile people up by going to work practically topless. I like that she got a good couple of minutes to herself because she, like Vivian, was also very important to the UK punk fashion, and with how she would avert the male gaze by pushing her sexuality to make the people who gawk uncomfortable. And I like how she has a little bit of an arc in a later episode where she tells some teenagers who travel to see the band to just go home and not bother, as she could tell that it wasn't to last. Rook was even in contact with the actress who played her and was somewhat involved before she passed away early this year. Rest in peace. But damn, the fact that they let seemingly everyone other than John have a say in this series is very sad and very suspect. It's in this episode where you really feel them trying to milk the Rise section of Rise and Fall, and it makes it feel so cheap, like an after-school special. They even play Elvis before Steve first tries to play guitar and blows ass. I usually like juxtaposition like that, but this sort of thing's been done so many times before, and it makes biopics like these all feel the same. Even though the story of the Sex Pistols is so unique, so many things are spelt out to us, like how when Sid is given his name.
Hello, Sid. We'll call you Sid, after the hamster.
Sid's really vicious.
They somewhat pulled together during the first rehearsal with John and his audition, but that's about it. And the soundtrack can be distractingly bad and out of place sometimes, like during their first show after John joins the band.
I've already sorted this with your manager.
We don't give a shit.
It's our amp, or you don't play. I bet it's fucking stolen anyway.
Spoon?
This sounds like something you'd hear in Inception. It doesn't fit at all.
Spoon?
And the symbolism and commentary are so on the nose at points, it really just takes you out of it. If it was any more on the nose, I would need reconstructive surgery on my snout. Episode 3 has a lot of disturbing imagery relating to Pauline, the woman whom Johnny based the song Bodies about. I like that it's played kind of like a mystery. I mean, I thought she was polystyrene or something at first. And the bag she carries around is treated like the briefcase from Pulp Fiction, which has a slightly different effect on everybody who sees what's in it.
So you really don't.
It is later revealed that she keeps her aborted child in that bag, and when John finds out, despite being creeped out by it, and being creeped out by her in general since she stalks him, he treats her with respect and understanding. And it's a nice little mini arc in this episode, since he avoids her like the plague for much of the runtime. And it shows the tender side of John Lydon, which isn't talked about too much on account of him being a fucking loudmouth. I also like how they showed them riding anarchy in the UK. The scenes showed the strengths and weaknesses of every member of the band, and how they congealed to make the Sex Pistols special. Again, I wish it wasn't so stereotypical, but I'll take what I can get. Though, I don't really like how they explained the spitting phenomenon, which the UK punk scene was famous for. They showed Sid spitting at some upset bikers, and that was that apparently. If you ask me, that's such a missed opportunity. While it's a bit up in the air as to how all the spitting started, it's generally accepted that it was either rat scabies of the damned, or John himself who started it due to his sinus issues making him spit on stage a lot. They could have easily showed John having sinus problems throughout the episode with him like the doctor's office, and resolving it by the end with him spitting at the crowd. That would have been a neat B-plot for an episode. Or they could have shown Rat doing it with the Damned, since the Damned and the Pistols shared many stages in those days. I just wish they could have shown other bands within the scene. All we get is of course Chrissy and Susie Sue, but that's it. We get some references to The Clash, the Ramones, and the New York Dolls. They could have briefly talked about the Damned beating the Pistols to the punch and releasing a single and album, the Ramones touring the UK and how it impacted the scene, or even Sid playing drums at the first ever Susie and the Banshees gig. There's so much untapped potential here. It's frustrating as a viewer. There's also a B-plot with Chrissy trying to sham marry Steve and Johnny so she can stay in the UK. Steve flakes because he gets preoccupied, and Chrissy gets mad at him for cheating on him and embarrassing her on her big day, even though the marriage is quite literally a sham.
I thought we were friends, but you humiliated me on my fake wedding day. My fucking happy day.
And she's a hypocrite because she's cheating on her boyfriend, journalist Nick Kent, played by Ferdier Walsh-Pilo, and she even insults him when he finds out she's not fake marrying him.
You could have at least told me.
Why?
I'm your boyfriend.
Are you?
Does she really have a leg to stand on here? They could have done something here. She could have had some time to self-reflect and realize what she did was pretty much the same thing she did to Nick, but instead it's forgotten about, and Steve and Chrissy go back to being friends/fuck buddies by the next episode. Episode 4 includes more of Steve's stepdad and the hatred he has for him, the Grundy Show and its fallout, and the dismissal of Glenn. The Grundy Show is handled pretty well. I really like how they mix in some of the original footage here and there with the new footage. I mean, it's done so well, I doubt someone who wasn't a mega nerd like me for punk history could even tell the difference. I mean, they even replicate subtle things like how Steve is holding his cigarettes, how Glenn talks to Grundy, and how John rocks back and forth in his chair. But I don't like how they have to spell it out and milk it with Steve cursing out Grundy for being a dirty old man.
Go on, again.
You dirty fucker.
What a clever boy.
What a fucking rotter.
Well, that's it for tonight.
You dirty fucker. You dirty fucker.
I understand he's also saying it to his stepdad, but they took what could have been subtext and made it too obvious. A little bit of subtlety wouldn't hurt you. Craig! Episode 5 introduces Nancy Spungen, played by Emma Appleton, who, yeah. Spoiler alert. And she's not awful, but she isn't really good either. I don't like her voice. She sounds like Jennifer Tilly on Downers.
Do you know the Heartbreakers? Like where Johnny Thunders used to be in the New York Dolls. Yeah. Anyway, Michael Wazowski!
They just make her out to be a clueless junkie who fucks up Sid's life. When it wasn't Nancy who fucked up Sid's life, it was Sid who fucked up Sid's life. Sure, she sure as shit didn't help the situation at all, and she probably was incredibly annoying to be around, but the near villainization of a mentally ill girl straight out of school is just so gross. They even included the scene of her on the toilets talking to Chrissy, which 1 is just flat out mean, and 2 acts as insulting potty humor.
I mean, he is my only hope, and he did say, the only person who's delivered so far is shit's mom, would you believe? You know what, I'm gonna close this.
Craig! And they introduce her to submission, because of course they did. They do show that she somewhat cares for Sid and isn't just some ditzy groupie, but the damage was already done. Besides, isn't this series supposed to focus on Steve? This episode also shows the band recording Nevermind the Bollocks, but I don't like how when John is recording the vocals, they also have the original vocals underneath them.
God save the Queen! We made it!
I know in some biopics they'll merge the original vocals and the vocals from the actor to make it sound more natural, but there was no attempt here. They should have just left Anson Boone's vocals alone, they're fine enough. If nothing else, it's better than what they did in Bohemian Rhapsody. And I like how earlier in the episode they showed that Sid wasn't completely destitute on bass. He just mostly was. But they could have showed him in the studio a little bit. I know he really did come down with hepatitis and was in the hospital, but I know he played at least some of the bass on Bodies, and there's a lot of opportunities with Sid in the recording studio. Once again, missed opportunity. I mean, I like the stuff where the band take their first ever 7-inch to John and Steve's parents' place, but besides that, this episode didn't really have much going for it. It's surprising how even though the series didn't even start that great, it still loses all the steam it once had by the end. And we limp into episode 6 with the finale of the series. They really overuse the archival footage in this one, and they don't even make an attempt to meld it with new footage like how they have already been shown to be capable of doing in this series. We might get a filter or something, but that's about it. It's something you could do on your iPhone. I don't know if their budget ran dry by episode 6, but either the money was gone or someone stopped caring. Another big thing I noticed was how thick they laid on the fall portion of the Rise and Fall. Maybe they had another episode planned and they had to cut it, so they had to put all the bad shit involving the band's breakup at the end. I mean, hell, we don't even get a mention of Pill, even though John was recording Public Image first issue at the same time most of the tracks of the Great Rock and Roll Swindle were being laid down. Johnny singing Public Image would have worked way better thematically than hearing Chrissy sing Brass and Pockets, I'll say that much. Especially since Public Image was a diss track towards his former bandmates in Malcolm. I also don't get how Vivian can claim any sort of moral high ground when Malcolm goes mad with power trying to monetize the death of Sid and Nancy, when we hear her say this in a couple scenes prior when Nancy died.
It gives me a very good idea for a shirt.
But this episode isn't all bad. I like how they revealed Nancy's death and that it wasn't focused on it too much. I mean, there's a much better biopic you can watch if you want to see more of that. I like that they made the song No Fun the first thing they ever played, so it being the last ever thing they play at the winter show wraps everything up nicely and makes everything kind of come full circle. I like the character dynamics at play here, especially the scenes between Steve and Johnny. They both make good points and seem real despite the actors playing larger-than-life people. And I also like that the series ends at Huddersfield. God knows after this episode the audience probably needed a pick-me-up. And that was a great choice. The Huddersfield shows were by many accounts some of the best shows this band ever played. They were happy, it was for a good cause, and it showed the humanity of the punk movement. But once again, they laid on way too thick with the Queen's narration at the end.
Let us all strive to spread our Christian spirit of generosity throughout the coming year. God bless you all, and a very happy Christmas.
Craig! So that was Pistol, and I can't say I didn't get what I expected. I knew it wasn't made for people like me, and it made the viewing experience much more pleasurable. I've said this before, but I can enjoy dumb band movies and things of the like. Hell, if I can get a kick out of that pretty bad Darby Crash biopic, I can probably be entertained by just about anything involving a band I like. Sure, it had its fair share of issues, first and foremost the writing. Goddamn you, Craig. But the direction, cinematography, performances, set design, costuming, and respect for what this band did in the 70s are all good to bloody excellent. But a half-baked script lets down a project from being excellent to something to chuck on in the background on Disney Plus if you have a passing interest in music history. As for how it shapes up against the other Pistols films, I'd say it hits a weird middle ground. You watch Sid and Nancy if you want a good film and don't care much for historical accuracy. You watch Filth and the Fury if you just want a good idea of how it all went down. And you watch The Great Rock and Roll Swindle if you want to question why I got out of bed this morning. And Pistol is true to what happens than Sid and Nancy, but it's not as well made, and it won't stay with you the same way. But if you care that much about the history, then just watch The Filth and the Fury. I unfortunately find it pretty hard to recommend this to anyone besides big Sex Pistols fans. And if I'm being honest, I'm not sure if I can even do that after Johnny rubbished this thing to such an extent. But if this seems like something you might like, then I still can't recommend it since I just spoiled every episode. But oh well. If anything, this just makes me really nervous about that Netflix biopic they're making about Joey Ramone with fucking Pete Davidson of all people. But now, I feel the best way to end this already too long video is with a quote from someone who unfortunately isn't here today to give his thoughts like everyone else who is in this band is able to. I hate films. It's pretense, it's lies, it's just shit. If you filmed a day in the life of me, for instance, that's the most boring thing on earth. It makes me sick to think that people will act out parts and make it all seem larger than life, just so some crud out there can get off on some fantasy.